welcome to the 2017 International Conference. What an honor it is to be speaking in front of you all today. In this very room, we have over 20 countries represented in all 50 states. And whether we came from across the country or across the globe, we are all gathered here with the same intent, to end poverty. Without a doubt, these next few days will be unforgettable as we learn from the experts, surround ourselves with inspiring activists, and lobby on Capitol Hill. For myself, this is my very first international conference. I first became involved with results during my sophomore year of high school, and now, as a rising senior, I could not be more thrilled to be surrounded by such inspiring individuals. Prior to my involvement with results, I never dreamed I would be able to be on the stage, advocate on Capitol Hill, or even have a meeting with my legislator. I especially never imagined I could do all this at 17. For me, political involvement seemed unreachable, something that was meant for older and more experienced individuals. Politics was the evening news and House of Cards. It was not letters to the editors back and forth to senators. When I became involved with results, all of my assumptions of politics and political engagement were confronted. I now know political engagement is a tool for change unlike any other. For what else could have such a profound effect in such a short amount of time? Before I got involved with results, my main means of service was volunteering, chiefly through donation and drives. I would spend days, weeks, and months driving around my home state of Vermont, collecting items, reaching out to organizations, and promoting my projects. By the end, I'd collected 5,000 items, and while they would undoubtedly make some impact, they could never come close to the billions of dollars that could result from the Global Partnership for Education, or the impacts of national programs like Medicaid or food stamps. I remember the first time I met my senator, Senator Leahy. I was so excited I was actually shaking. I couldn't believe I was meeting my very first congressman. I was even more ecstatic when he recognized me for my work with results in other groups. Overall, my favorite part of the meeting wasn't with the senator, but rather the knowledge I left with. After that encounter, I knew that my actions had effects and my voice was being heard. As a youth, it is so empowering to know people who are making decisions that directly impact me and my generation are actually listening and using our voices to make change. This is what results is all about. Through our collective voice and continued activism, we will have the ability to change the world in a way we couldn't alone. This is why our advocacy is so important. Change doesn't come naturally. It comes from your tireless work. It comes from town halls and media and back-to-back meetings with our legislators. It comes from having classmates, family, and strangers write letters to the editor and conferences like this. It would be no hyperbole to say this conference is unlike any other in its power and possibility. Through your work these next couple days, we will truly use our voices to change the world. Now, I am pleased to introduce our Executive Director, Dr. Joanne Carter. Joanne sits on the boards of some of the world's leading institutions to fight poverty. She's testified before Congress, been featured in media all around the world, and more. But perhaps most importantly, she started her work with results as a volunteer, just like so many of us in this room. This marks Joanne's 25th year on results staff. 25 years ago, she left her job as a veterinarian to become legislative director for results. She became associate executive director in 2007 and was named executive director in 2008. I'm thrilled to welcome her to the stage today. Here's Joanne.
I have to say I love this part. It's hard here in Washington some days. This is really great. Thank you, Kiran. Thank you for that introduction, but really even more, thank you for the model of courage and commitment and power that you are. And Kiran mentioned what it was like for her to meet her senator, but I want to share just a word about what her senator said it was like to meet her. So Kiran, we asked Senator Leahy about you, and here's what he said. He said, "I'm extremely proud of Vermonter Kiran Waqar. Her commitment to social justice and her advocacy with results illustrate the power of one individual and the collective power of an organization comprised of many voices with a shared vision. And he said, in difficult times like this, it is young people like Kiran who give me hope for the future. And that was from Senator Patrick Leahy, one of the most senior and influential folks in the United States Senate. So it's really my great honor to welcome all of you to the 2017 Results International Conference. And as you heard from Kiran, this is actually my 25th year in Washington on Results staff. And if you remember nothing else that I say today, the single most important thing that I want to share that I have learned by far in my 25 years is what Kiran and so many of you have proved. And that really is the power of passionate, committed advocates to shape government priorities and create profound change. You know, not paid lobbyists, not public relations firms, but thoughtful, informed, and deeply committed constituents. And in this critical moment, I really do believe that that is more important than it has ever been. You know, at Results, we have a dual mission, which is reaching the end of poverty and also building the movement of advocates to actually get us there and keep us there. Because as this current moment makes very clear, progress toward equity and justice is not guaranteed, and the arc of that progress is not a smooth one. You know, and I really do believe that the best hope for protecting the progress that we have achieved, but also driving even greater ambition, is grounded in all of you. As you heard also from Kiran, we have folks from every corner of the United States and from over 20 countries. We're covering every continent except Antarctica. And I was saying, if you've been outside, somebody would probably be very willing to do that expansion trip to the South Pole right now. With us today, we also have a group of new young leaders here as part of the Real Change Fellowship from all over the US, so welcome. And also for the second year in a row, Real Change Fellows from Zambia, which is fantastic. And many former Real Changers who in the room too have gone on to do amazing things in Results as leaders and in the world. We have our wonderful volunteer group leaders and regional coordinators, frankly, whose dedication truly makes this work possible day in, day out. To our sponsors, BRAC, the Global Partnership for Education, 1,000 Days, Results for Development, the Stop TB Partnership, TB Alliance, the Washington Court, Power of Nutrition, and so many more. And we're really grateful because you have helped all of us, and because you've helped make this conference possible. And I also want to just say a thank you to a couple of special guests who have joined us today and whose partnership and vision has helped propel our work, including author and lecturer Marianne Williamson. I've heard from everybody that was in her morning session that it was amazing. And to artist and advocate Yvonne Chaka Chaka, who's going to be with us. And I also want to say, especially to those of you with firsthand experience of poverty, and those of you with firsthand experience of the diseases that we're working to end, you know the reality and the truth of these issues. Your voices have enormous power. Your insights are guideposts for our shared efforts. Because thank you for being here. You really are the bedrock and the leaders in this fight. So thank you. And I am absolutely thrilled to have so many new people with us. So how many of you are here for the first time today? Can you raise your hands? Wow. Your presence has never been more important, and I really mean that. You know, I mentioned that it's my 25th year, and you know, you heard I started as a volunteer. I got hooked for life, and I am not the only one. There are many people in this room who've been doing this work for decades, but I do want to give a special shout out. I'm not actually even sure if she's here yet, but I want to give a special shout out to one advocate from New Jersey who set up all of their group's lobby meetings for next Tuesday, but who actually had to take a short pause from that work last week in order to celebrate her 90th birthday. So Phyllis, is Phyllis here yet? I'm not sure if she's here yet, but when you see Phyllis Alroy, you got to wish her a happy 90th birthday. So I think I am safe in saying that in my time with results, I've seen a lot, but I have not seen a moment quite like this one. And what I want to talk about today, even and actually especially in this moment of profound challenges, is grabbing tight to our vision. A vision that's grounded in equity and in justice, a world where nobody is left behind, and what it will actually take to get there. And that starts with people like Kiran and like Phyllis and people like all of you. We know that we are actually in a perilous political moment in many ways. You know, many of our governments and some of our neighbors are turning inward, turning away, and shutting people out, sometimes literally. You know, we see this in the US for certain, but in too many other places around the world as well. You know, in the UK with the Brexit vote, you know, ominous caste and class and religious violence and closing down of political space in India, closing political space in places like Kenya, deep forces of xenophobia and racism and negativity driving elections and the public discourse with a new vengeance. So we really need to take action where we are able to act, those of us who have the freedom to act. And we should never take that for granted. You know, we have partners, and I know we know this, but we have partners all over the world and in this country who put their lives at risk in taking political action. You know, whether because of immigration status or refugee status, their caste or their race or their ethnic or religious group, their gender or gender identity, or because they just dare to defy the accepted narrative. Political advocacy has never been more urgent a calling and has never been a more precious one. But one of the most remarkable aspects of this moment for me, and one that I believe we will look back on as pivotal, is the massive upsurge in people wanting to be politically engaged. You know, hundreds of thousands, right? Hundreds of thousands of people making calls to Congress here in the US, tens of thousands showing up at town hall meetings. You may, and I hope you did, see the New York Times piece that wrote about your work earlier this month, which said, if you're looking to bolster participatory democracy, you'd be hard-pressed to find better guidance than the experience of results volunteers. But the other thing the New York Times piece said, it called results one of America's best kept secrets. Now let us be clear, this was meant as a compliment, but this is not the goal. And you know, this moment just sets all of us up to be organizers, you know, just to respond to the hunger that's out there right now to be more deeply engaged. You know, so who knows somebody who made their first ever call to Capitol Hill in the last 6 months? And maybe it's some of you, and if it isn't, really glad to have you here. You know, who has heard friends or family saying they feel compelled to do something, you know, that they feel like they have to respond to this moment, right? The demand and the hunger to have deeper political impact is the biggest I have ever seen. You know, so I'm asking you to think now that on Tuesday, when you're feeling that rush of talking to policymakers face to face, I want you to be asking yourself and your partners, who's the next person you can invite to join you in this work? And I don't mean that in a theoretical way, I mean that in a really practical way. Like, who can you share this with? Who will you go back and share this with who is ready to hear this and dying to hear this? I was recently rewatching a video of the late Senator Bob Bennet, who many of you may remember, a longtime Republican senator from Utah, who became a Senate champion on microfinance. And in the video, he's talking about results work and reflecting back on when volunteer Scott Leckman first came to his office just after he was elected in the 90s. And he talks about everything that Scott and the volunteers in Utah did over the years. And then he grins, and he kind of looks into the camera, grins, and he says, all you have to do is multiply that by 50 states. And now, those of you who know me know that I really get excited about targets. And we've had our eye on this 50-state goal for a long time. So again, as you heard from Kiran, I'm really proud to say that we are making it a reality. We now have results groups taking action in every single state and in our own District of Columbia. Alabama to Alaska, Wyoming to Wisconsin to Wyoming, and for the first time ever, all 50 states and DC. You know, and this is not just for the sake of being able to say all 50 states, although I really do like the sound of that. But we know what makes impact on Capitol Hill is Congress hearing directly and powerfully from their own constituents. You know, and so many of these life and death decisions that Congress makes come down to just a handful of legislators. You know, we have seen that so vividly playing out in real time here on healthcare in the US. And we've experienced it over and over again over the last 30 plus years, internationally as well, how one or two congressional or parliamentary champions, with our support, can drive profound change, especially on issues that are dying for lack of attention. Global diseases like tuberculosis and malaria, basic education for the poorest kids, economic opportunity for the most impoverished countries and people. Senator Bennet knew from his experience, both of Congress and of the power of results folks, why it would be so important that now every single US senator will be hearing from us on Tuesday. And in this unpredictable political moment, when the congressional and parliamentary allies that we build really do make a life and death difference, I also want to say that our commitment to nonpartisanship and building support across the political spectrum is more important than it's ever been. I know it can sometimes feel challenging, but the truth is making issues of poverty and their impact real for policymakers, building relationships, offering solutions, has always been our strength. And if we decide, and if we commit not to write people off, we have the chance to move them, regardless of where they may be starting or where we think they may be starting. It doesn't mean we win everyone over, but it means that you might. And we really do never know who our next ally, but also our next champion is going to be. And this past winter, I met with a relatively new member of Congress to talk about ending preventable child deaths globally. And in this meeting, he literally said to me, looks at me and he said to me, "I will do whatever you want. I'll talk to whoever you want in Congress or the administration." And as a Republican from a swing district, he's really well placed to do that. He also said, "I was told when I came here in Congress to pick one or two issues. This is mine." And he's a former district attorney and doesn't have any particular history in working on child health or international issues. And I've heard him say, on the face of it, I'm not who you might expect to be passionate about this. But he says he always cared, and then he had a child, and he said it completely transformed him. And then, and this is the other really important part, what got him to take this on in Congress was, and he tells this story, was just weeks after his daughter was born, one constituent brought this issue to him. And that one person was a results volunteer. Joanne Donato, are you here yet? There she is. And in the last few months, this congressman has penned an op-ed, testified on these issues before a key subcommittee, and just last Wednesday, he spoke really passionately at a congressional briefing on early childhood development, where he was also joined by the Muppets. So, and not every meeting is going to go like that. I know that. But that's the power we can have, and we really never know who's ready to engage or to lead until we ask. And in the US, we have seen the power of grassroots advocacy, as we said before, unfolding daily. If you asked anyone in January of this year to predict what lay ahead on healthcare, the answer seemed clear. The fight would be over in a matter of weeks. But instead, look where we are. And anyone who's following this, it is a very complex story with lots of political factors. But I believe, again, when we look back, one of the biggest stories of 2017 will be the grassroots upsurge to protect health care, and especially Medicaid, our country's most important health insurance for low-income people. And that includes the Herculean efforts of people in this room, mobilizing in key states, publishing scores of pieces of media, and so many people sharing their personal stories and supporting other people to share their stories, which is incredibly important if we actually are going to transform this issue. And that work on Medicaid is helping drive a record-breaking media year for our volunteers in the US, with 500 hits and counting. So who here in the US or elsewhere, who here has gotten a piece of media published in 2017? Just raise your hands. Fantastic. Brilliant. On our US poverty issues alone, you've already published more media in the first 6 months of this year than any prior year in our whole history. And is Tiffany Woods here? Is Tiffany here? Okay. Well, I just want to give a shout out that she started writing letters to the editor for the first time last summer, just one example. And the letters she submitted in her hometown paper in Wisconsin have been reprinted almost 50 times in 15 states. And that's just one example. And we're also on track for a record year of meetings with Congress. In just the first 100 days of the new Congress administration, you've had over 300 meetings and helping set the agenda, not just respond to it. It's okay. And even in this divisive and partisan US healthcare fight, really importantly, you are reminding lawmakers more fundamentally of what's at stake and why for decades Medicaid has been an issue that's had strong bipartisan support. In the face of a White House budget that would decimate funding for global anti-poverty programs, you've been in the lead on shoring up the bipartisan support in Congress that we've had over decades. Because Congress will be the bulwark against cuts to these programs, these life-saving programs. And with support that's crossed party lines, even when not much else could, and you're making sure that that continues. So who here has had a meeting with a member of Congress or their staff, or with a member of Parliament or their staff this year? Just raise your hands. Brilliant, amazing. Thank you, thank you. And speaking of Parliament, where are our folks from Results UK? Can you just raise your hands for a minute? Results UK, okay. So last year, literally the day before this conference last year, we woke up to the news of the Brexit vote in the UK to leave the European Union. And at that time, we were all working right in the middle of a global push to amass $13 billion in commitments from governments for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, the world's largest funder of low and middle income country efforts to fight those diseases. And then the UK government literally changed overnight, and we had no idea if the UK's support for the Global Fund would hold. And in a real way, in some ways, the world, or certainly many of us, held our breath because that $13 billion goal would only happen with the UK at the table. And in that moment, we saw that sometimes the rewards of our advocacy come years later, because our partners in Results UK and their allies had been building parliamentary support for these issues for well over a decade. You know, and we're going to hear from one of those wonderful MP champions on Tuesday morning. But this meant, this work that they had done over the decades, as soon as the new minister was in office, she was hearing from other politicians from her own party, her colleagues, about how important the Global Fund was. And not only did the UK show up 2 months later, but the new minister announced the British government's largest ever pledge to the Global Fund and has become a champion for that fund. And in Zambia, our colleagues from CITAM, where are Zambia colleagues? Just raise your hands. Right. Our colleagues from CITAM started writing letters last summer to ask the Zambian government to make its first ever pledge to the Global Fund. So Zambia actually gets significant resources from the Global Fund, but the idea was that making a pledge, even a modest one, would be a huge sign of support by that government for the Global Fund. So they started with a few letters, then found others to write, and eventually they hand-delivered hundreds of letters to the Ministers of Finance and Minister of Health, and it worked. And for the first time ever, Zambia made a pledge of $3 million to the Global Fund. And together, the people in this room And others who couldn't be with us showed the power of our global partnership from Australia and Canada, France and Brussels, Japan, Kenya, South Africa, Italy, South Korea, the US, the UK, Zambia, and more. We played a key role in raising the resources for the Global Fund that will save 14 million lives and move us closer to ending these diseases. So raise your hand if you took action on this. Thank you. So we can't forget these successes as we face the challenges ahead. And what's coming out of Washington this year isn't just ignoring people living in poverty, it's often harming them the most. And we need look no further than healthcare. In all its legislative iterations this spring, one thing is held constant: the targeting of programs for people living in poverty, threatening Medicaid coverage for tens of millions of low-income families, people with disabilities, children and the elderly, frankly, to give tax cuts in that particular case back to wealthy Americans. And the House Budget Committee just passed a resolution that would fast-track massive cuts for other really important anti-poverty programs like SNAP, what used to be called food stamps, stripping food from the tables of low-income families. And meanwhile, programs supporting people living in poverty globally face some of the steepest cuts in any part of the White House budget proposal. And we're talking about funds that support countries to provide life-saving HIV/AIDS and TB treatment, vaccines, quality education, nutrition, and more for millions of people. So these proposals will only push people further to the margins, and we need to do the opposite. In our policies, in our budgets, people experiencing poverty and otherwise marginalized and at risk need to come first and not last. And we are fighting against formidable challenges, political challenges, but not just that, systemic ones. Centuries-old forces of racism and colonialism, classism, sexism, and more. When we look at the progress made, and then we look at who's been left behind, this is clear. Who lives below poverty in this country? Who are the kids around the world not in school? Who are the people not accessing treatment and prevention for HIV/AIDS? Far too often the answer is defined by race, by ethnic group, by gender, by caste, by sexual orientation. These forces shape our systems and our policies deeply, but they are not naturally occurring. They are systems of injustice and oppression that we as a society have created over the centuries. But what bad policy has helped create, good policy can help undo. We need a commitment to reaching real equity, truly leaving no one behind, and ensuring equity of outcomes for everyone. The world has collectively set some powerful goals, and we actually have the data to show that they can be achieved. The end of preventable deaths of mothers and children, the end of malnutrition and physical and mental stunting, the end of AIDS and tuberculosis and other diseases of poverty, and the end of extreme poverty itself. A set of sustainable development goals that are focused on leaving no one behind. These current ambitious goals, first of all, are only possible because of how far our advocacy, including by many in this room, has helped bring us in the last 20 to 30 years. Deaths of young children have been slashed by nearly 2/3 since 1990. There are 40 million fewer children missing out on primary school. On many of these issues, we're now more than halfway there. And in some cases, we're literally working on reaching the last mile, when not so long we had barely gone the first mile. But getting the rest of the way is not a given. It's going to take more than we've got right now, more than the people in this room, more than the people in this movement, more congressional and parliamentary champions to make what's possible a priority. Some of you know a longtime friend and partner in our movement and a leader in the global fight against HIV/AIDS, Maureen Moranga. And Maureen tells this story, and we asked if we could share it today, of the early 2000s in Kenya when she learned that she was HIV positive along with her young son. And she was sent home with a death sentence for both of them and joined a support group whose purpose at that time was to support each other to die with dignity. And that was years after life-saving treatment actually existed, but almost no one in lower income countries had access to it. And the injustice was not just the lack of access to treatment, but the belief among world leaders and others that it wasn't possible and wasn't urgent to reach the people who needed it. And the idea that things are bad, but there's nothing we can do, or nearly as damaging, things are bad, and all we can do is make it just a little bit better. But a little better is not enough, not then and not now. In a moment when we're facing so many threats, it's even easier to lower our expectations and to lose sight of our vision and to settle for less. And really committing ourselves to equity, believing in getting to the end, leaving nobody behind, this changes our perception of what's possible. And then we commit ourselves, and when we commit ourselves to something, it forces us to then answer the question of how we get there. Because equity won't happen by accident. It will happen only by the demand that it's right and the persuasion that it's possible. Here in this country, we are in a battle to protect what we've long called the social safety net. You know, that's absolutely required, but we can't confuse stopping cuts with our goal. The safety net doesn't catch everybody as it is. We need desperately programs like Medicaid and SNAP, but we also need the ambition to say that more is possible and more is needed, that the racial wealth gap is unacceptable and must be closed, that we can no longer afford to have systems that set up entire groups of people to fail, that we need policies that undo the deep effects of discriminatory systems. You know, in the United States, policymakers haven't yet really even embraced a serious goal for ending poverty in our own country. And this isn't for lack of resources or infrastructure. Too often it seems we don't actually want to know the reality of poverty and hunger in our own communities. You know, and that it can be easier to blame people living in poverty, ignoring the structural and intergenerational drivers of poverty. Again, the racism and classism and others that sustain the status quo. Ending this requires supporting ambitious policies grounded in equity. And if we're going to dismantle the forces of oppression in the world, we also need to work on dismantling them in our own movement. You know, and this means looking honestly at the forces of oppression within our work. It means examining where power lies, where privilege exists, and taking down barriers and actively promoting a more deeply inclusive approach. You know, we need to examine who's at the table and who's in the lead. And the real experts on poverty, those who have experienced it firsthand, need to be at the center, not as examples or characters in stories, but as our leaders. Here this weekend, we have 14 advocates who are part of the Experts on Poverty program and many others with firsthand experience with poverty. And I just want to say that your expertise and your advocacy is not only shaping our vision for the future, but actually moving people in action to make it a reality, busting myths, making these issues real, and making policymakers understand what's at stake and what's behind it. In the healthcare fight right now, you're leading the way both in advocacy and organizing. Kiana mobilizing women at shelters in New Orleans to write letters to their senators. Asia working with advocates in 5 different states to share their stories with members of Congress. Tiana getting published in the Washington Post, calling on the House leadership to listen to those with firsthand experience of Medicaid. And also here today, as you've seen, are powerful advocacy partners from countries with high burdens of poverty and disease who are leading our global movement. Rosemary from Kenya on stage at the replenishment of the Global Fund and on stage shortly now. Carol from Zambia leading the work back at home and speaking at a congressional briefing next Wednesday that we hope you will invite your members' staff to. And Maureen, who I mentioned earlier. Maureen, whose doctors sent her home to die. For 15 years, Maureen has fought back. She helped turn her support group into an advocacy group. She fought for her own life and her son's, and then fought for hundreds of adolescent girls with HIV in Kenya through the organization she founded to support them, and then for millions of people with her global advocacy. And this week, UNAIDS announced that there are now 19.5 million people living with HIV thanks to life-saving treatment. 19.5 million people. And Maureen has not only dedicated herself to every day to reaching the end of AIDS, but in this fraught moment in the United States, she actually came here to help us find a way forward, building the movement that we needed here. She visited the US to help us grow the base of advocates and did a pretty grueling and also quite inspiring tour across 6 states, launching new result groups and moving people across this country into action. Maureen couldn't be here with us today, but we asked her what message she wanted to share with all of you. And it was, my life is evidence of what is possible. And she is right on so many levels. Today we know that we won't win every fight. But if we lose our vision for what is possible, we will have already lost. The end of AIDS and tuberculosis is possible. The end of poverty is possible. Equity is possible. Justice is possible. All of this is possible, but none of it is guaranteed. And that's where you come in, and that's why we're here together. So I want to just end by saying, let's get going, and thank you for being here.